everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of the AIGA Design Podcast. I'm Julia Donatello, Design Competitions and Events Manager at AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. And my co-host?
I'm Lishan Huang, Co-Executive Director of Learning and Programs here at AIGA. And this season of the show, we are exploring the theme of Eyes on Design. This theme is inspired by the Eye on Design magazine that ran from 2015 to 2022. We are bringing back this critical lens, this connecting eye and this future eye, looking at design practice, what we do as designers, what we make as designers, asking hard questions about what we do, how we do it, how it's changing, how we connect to other disciplines and industries, and where we're going in the future. Our guest this episode is Bryan Clark, who leads the subject of graphic design at Falmouth University in the UK, and he is responsible for the undergraduate degree and future strategic developments of postgraduate study and research in the subject at Falmouth. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. That's great to be here and looking forward to having a conversation with you about what we're up to at Falmouth. So thank you for the invitation.
So let's kickstart, Bryan. We wanted to hear a little bit from you, like what's the context, how did you get into design in the first place in your career, and then what brought you to design education at some point?
Of course. So I started, I guess I'm in a place at the minute where I've spent half of my career in industry and half in education. And I was lucky enough to work in some amazing studios. Part of the kind of heritage of the kind of story of graphic design, whether that's through companies like Lewis Mobley, where I was a creative partner and director, working on projects all around the world. And also earlier parts of my career, I worked for sort of basically spin-offs from Pentagram. And that sort of interesting connection also came through my own education, where I was probably taught by one of Bob Gill's, the original Fletcher Forbes Gills, one of his students at the Royal College of Art. So the kind of passing down of the baton from various sort of the provenance and pedigree of the story of design. And as I carried on through my professional career, I was gradually doing more and more educational work. And also working with D&AD, which is obviously your cross-Atlantic version of AIGA, where I was a trustee and director. And gradually I was doing more and more things with universities to the point where I thought, actually, I think I want to jump the board and actually work full time. So there's a kind of really interesting part of that mix, which is largely when we're developing courses at Falmouth, that actually we have this interplay between sort of industry, where industry is going, but also actually from a subject point of view and a learning perspective, what can we do to kind of challenge and provoke new ways of learning? So that's my story really in terms of how I got into design. And actually, in some ways, the things that drive me are great ideas and excellent craft. And I think I always say to people, whether I'm in an amazing design studio in industry or an amazing studio in education, the thing I'm looking for is that exciting work, a curious mind, and a sort of really interest in provoking people's ideas of what design is and what it can do. So yeah, I see both as a similar kind of balance, which I love about being in education, but also connecting with industry through everything we do. So, I feel in a very privileged position. So that's my story to date.
Yeah, that's great. And I love what you said about innovative ways to learn and teach design. So I'm going to jump into that. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the university and the online Masters in Graphic Design program that I know you've been involved with. So if you can get a little bit more into detail of what the program looks like, what is the type of the students that look for them, and what are the type of work that they're offering.
Of course. So I guess I should start with Falmouth in a sense that as an art school, we have 120 years of experience. And actually the faculty of graphic design has been going for over 40 years. So we've kind of had a really good chance to sort of understand our subjects. And also, we might say Cornwall is at the kind of edge of the UK, but actually its history is a really exciting one. We were a strong part of the Industrial Revolution. The sort of first communication pipelines went from Cornwall to India and New York. The first digital message was sent from Cornwall to Southern Ireland. So we like to think we've got a really strong heritage in the world of sort of communications. And I think what sort of came about through the reason for starting the online presence was that actually sometimes I've asked that actually why did we do online? Actually, there's a large part of that which is about how can we extend our reach? How can we create more accessible and inclusive approaches to design education? And actually, it wasn't in making this. Sometimes I also think that, in fact, if we were making design courses now, how would we deliver them? And in fact, the online space, in terms of the technology it allows us to engage with, is actually an environment where we can reach out to lots of different cultures around the world and understand how that sort of cross-cultural understanding of how we learn, how we live, and from your own city is really important. And what's really great about that is that we then end up having a whole series of students in different parts of the world where we're sharing the sort of global exploration of the subject. We're not bringing, of course, we have campus-based courses where we have international students coming here, but actually the kind of the key thing is that fascinates us is like, how do we innovate the learning space? How does that create a more inclusive and diverse kind of community of learners? And also what that actually does in terms of the opportunities for those students to not only learn about a subject they love or want to kind of learn more about, but also kind of connect with other ways of understanding the subject, which I think is like really important. And that might come about, I guess, from in terms of our understanding of our audience, it could be that we're looking or engaging with students who are sort of, if you like, looking at a transition between maybe sort of one subject and another. They might be wanting to refresh their sort of critical and research orientated context of what they do. But they also may be wanting just to have a sort of change of tack. So therefore, it can be students who are taking some time out. So although the course runs over 2 years and students can do it part-time, actually, it might also be those individuals who want to bring something new into their own studios, or perhaps are in that sort of no man's land, which many designers have when they've been practicing for maybe, 4 to 10 years, where they think, actually, now's the time for me to launch my own studio. So we have a number of the sort of various modules that we have in the course allow for those different kind of perspectives to be engaged with what they do.
Yeah, I'd love to come back and dig deeper into the format of your course and especially how you're taking advantage of the online delivery and the spaces that you're creating across different geographies and cultures. But first, I'd like to step back a little bit and paint a picture of like what's going on in design education. We have a lot of educators who listen to the show, but we also have folks who have been maybe out of school for a while and are just practicing designers. But just to paint with broad brushstrokes, we have a lot of anxiety about AI right now. But even before that, this homogenization of design culture with social media flattening that, like kind of everyone looking at the same Pinterest boards, looking at the same kinds of inspirations. And obviously there's tons of stuff that's offline in archives that we don't see as designers. And so there's that kind of rupture with history. There's also just plenty of choices for people to learn design, whether they're self-taught from YouTube tutorials to a traditional in-person course to an online course like Falmouth. So yeah, can you give us a little bit of your perspective? How do you see where design industry is connecting with the state of design more generally right now?
Okay, so sort of a wide question there in terms of where I sort of begin with that. And I guess we have to kind of get a sense of, design has always kind of been in flux. It's like, and I suppose we try to get our students to kind of embrace that discomfort. How can we take courageous steps? How can we remain curious? There is potentially, as discussed, a kind of threat in around what the sort of AI and other kind of challenges might come about from how we work. But I suppose in terms of the we have a balance between understanding what industry is doing, but also challenging what industry could be. And actually, a lot of students and all of us are questioning about the role design has played in our society and what it has done. There's a lot of items of graphic design floating around our oceans and in the environment. So actually, I think even when I speak to industry, they're trying to get a sense of actually where are things going, how are we kind of navigating this kind of this story around the subject. But I think one of the key things is that whilst we are, for example, developing an online space, actually the key thing is that we remain curious about the world around us. We want to be informed by design and it's sort of the critical context of where it's been, but actually we also want to be inspired by life. So one of the challenges I often find, particularly with students, is actually around encouraging that. How do they notice the ignored? And we know, I've sort of, some of my sort of heroes and the people I mentioned, Fletcher Forbes Gill. I was at obviously Bob Gill has passed since, but he would often talk about redefining a design problem and actually kind of going to the source of an issue and waiting there and listening until you find something interesting to say about that subject. And then from that point of view, once you've found that, he often said, it's a miracle. It will design itself. Actually, we know that's not quite true. But actually, so we're listening to what industry have to say. And that's a big part of actually what we're doing. So even sort of Kenya Hara in Tokyo talks about sort of making the known unknown. So we have all these really kind of big voices and we're listening to those because, again, we can't just see design in its own sort of bubble. We're having to sort of look beyond and learn from different kind of cultural references. And that's why the global exploration of the subject is really important. And so I guess from in terms of where things are going, we're also looking at other studios that they're kind of maybe looking at cultural sectors, environmental, sustainable. And I think that's one of the key things that our students are looking for. Like, what is their role what is their responsibility in terms of the future of design? And so, in fact, I was in London just last week when I visited a studio called Wiedemann Lamp. They do a lot of, if you like, destination and placemaking, sort of global cultural working for the Louvre or working for London councils. And they've developed a whole range of different ways of working that can also be digital products for research or even having their own gallery where they're having an Otto Eicher exhibition or all sorts of different things that come in. So I think designers are questioning their responsibility. And we're seeing new kind of models, emergent practices that are coming through. And I guess the course, what that does and what we're trying to do is question what design is and what it can be. And I also think that design industry are also asking those questions, that we don't have to follow the same models. And I think the exciting thing about being in education or maybe in the hinterland is that we can actually start to explore those areas, and we don't have the business, the pressure of business to actually sort of force our hand. We can actually be free and open. And actually the key thing is we want to learn from our students, and I think when you look at the kind of graduates, postgrad or undergraduate industry are taking on, there used to be a time when actually you look through a portfolio, as I've done many times, and you wanted to see 10 branding, book design, digital experience design projects. Actually, a lot of the good studios now are saying, we'd maybe see a couple of those, but the others, we want to understand who you are, what your voice is, more experimental projects in terms of, so I think, times have changed quite dramatically. It's not the sort of, I think many sort of said that, in the 20th century, design was there to sort of designers were there to save the world. Now it's actually in the 21st century, it's design can save the world. And so we're moving from a kind of egocentric area to something else. And therefore, listening to all these voices, so Falmouth calling on this amazing network of alumni we have to actually input into our content, to offer students portfolio reviews, but also us to kind of draw on those voices so that students are sort of learning across different sort of cultural inputs.
Going back to this online format of the course, one of the things that came up in our previous conversations is that the online format is a feature and not a fallback, right? That you're really taking advantage of a global geography of your students, and, recreating this idea of the studio-based in-person design education and creating this global studio. I wanted to reflect on it from my own experience as well as a design educator. I mean, obviously we were forced into it during the pandemic, but even before that, I was teaching online or teaching in hybrid formats for many years now, for over a decade or almost a decade now. I've been teaching in this hybrid executive education course at Parsons, where it's an executive master's. So the folks are working, they're mid-career, they're senior design leaders. And so we gather, once every couple of months and then meet online in between. So it's taking advantage of the format to meet the students where they are, I guess is the point that I'm making. So I'd love to hear how you all are thinking about that at Falmouth, of like this online thing is not like the second best version of an in-person studio, but it's actually something different and maybe better given, these different trade-offs.
Yeah, and I suppose what happens, so obviously the course is designed to run over 2 years. So it's it enables students to basically work and study at the same time. The other thing is the actual modules are designed to, I suppose, bring in different sort of building blocks. So actually what you will have is some students coming from quite different backgrounds and have different directions. So there may be some in sort of more leadership roles who want to invest back into their own sort of practice. I think the important thing is we also have residentials. So basically in a similar way, I did a research degree at the Royal College of Art. We had sort of burst modules. So I think what we try to do is have a kind of consistency running through the course. So you will have sort of set modules. You'll also have time to have live stream debate. And the key thing about, I guess, the kind of global cohort is that everyone's working on different time zones.
Yeah.
So actually, one of the sort of beauties of that online environment, it's actually very inclusive. It allows for lots of different learning styles. And therefore, if you've listened to your sort of lectures and had that sort of debate, you can then review and kind of go back into those activities and actually sort of take your time to understand that learning in a specific kind of way. But the residentials become also really important. And actually, so they're varied. So sometimes we would come to Falmouth. So we can make use of the sort of making facilities here. It's something we're going to be doing more of in the future. In the past, we've also been to Berlin. We often link in with different designers in those cities. So students come into a cultural center. We do different projects, a little bit like you're saying, where we have these burst experiences. And it's really an amazing opportunity for designers and students to kind of come together and work. We also went to the Venice Biennale last year. So there's a kind of, again, students can kind of tailor make that to their own particular interests. And I think it's also really important. It's not a one size fits all. We have a very sort of, and obviously graphic design is continually evolving and emerging across lots of different platforms and lots of different environments. I think it's also really important that particularly at master's level, we're providing a space where the kind of the openness and the sort of rigor of a research orientated sort of learning style actually starts to sort of empower students to kind of maybe look at how we work in a different way. I actually have to say, when I did my sort of research degree, I found that actually having that using different types of research methods and working with users in a more participatory way, you suddenly start to be liberated by design. We're not selling these three ideas. We're actually asking our audience to get feedback, and it's a much more open, authentic way of understanding how research can play a part in the design process. So therefore, back to that sort of structure, there is the sort of over the 2 years, there's a kind of contemporary practice module where we really understand the broader global landscape of graphic design. And then we have these permutations where we look at more critical historical understanding of it. We have a studio and entrepreneurship module, which is really important because, again, some students are wanting to learn from different ways that different sort of specialisms collaborate. And we have a live project sort of field where we look at design competitions and working on live projects. And then we have the final major project. So the system is very flexible. It's kind of open. It embeds what we call the level 7, the sort of postgraduate sort of learning outcomes and a rigor that comes from that. And then we also invite students to come down or come back to Falmouth for their degree show their graduation ceremony at the end. So that's a really lovely point as well. Certainly for me as head of the department, when I suddenly see all these students coming from different parts of the world for their graduation. So, I think there's kind of similarities with some models. I think from Falmouth's perspective, I think we kind of have this balance between very strong industry networks and communities. And many of our students now, even from our campus-based courses, are working all around the world. So often we have scenarios where we can kind of put people in contact with various folk and offer that sort of support. In fact, it's fair to say that before the pandemic, even on campus-based courses, we used to do portfolio events where we'd go to London. We used to go to the Design Museum in London, and we invite sort of literally all of the great and the good from London's creative industry. When COVID came along, we shifted that online. We call it the creative community. So actually, what's really interesting is that we're kind of actually learning that sometimes the online space for portfolio reviews and others gives students so much more opportunity to engage with a variety of learning. So even on our undergraduate course, we had, hundreds of interviews that were given by industry to our students. And I think actually the freedom of that and different, we have some online tutors, for example, who are sort of teaching from Africa, from New York, different, sometimes they might be teaching in other universities. So there's a really sort of rich and diverse input into the sort of student experience. But that's the sort of remit for the spirit and structure of the course.
It's very interesting. And there's also another element of the Global Studio that I wanted to hear more from you in terms of how the program looks like. So we know that the students kind of have to build a collective map of making facilities around the world. So wherever they're based, so it could be bookbinding shops, screening, printing studios, or 3D printing labs. So how does it actually work in practice, and what do you think it changes in terms of the way the students work or even collaborate as a team, like as a remote team?
So that was a kind of a real conundrum to start off with, because obviously when you go to a university, you have this diversity of sort of making spaces, which is amazing. And actually students can come and do a master's course here, of course, in communication design. But actually for many, the abilities to study from their own city is really important. So what we thought at an early stage, because sort of thinking through making, through having that access to different sort of making facilities, like how are we going to sort of solve that problem? So it actually kind of started with one of the projects, which was actually looking at kind of the sort of identity of different cities through their typographic vernacular. So we created a Geo-Tagged Map where one of the projects asked them to sort of basically start to curate an archive globally of different types of typefaces and letter forms that existed in your city. So it kind of started like that. And then we thought, actually, we created this platform where suddenly you could look at lots of different cities and find out these wonderful spots where someone had highlighted different typefaces. And so actually, from a research point of view, we're actually using that platform to build a really fascinating archive. But at the same time, we thought, well, actually, the conundrum of actually needing making spaces. So through the course, students are encouraged to find making resources that will help them with their project. So, as you say, they might find the bookbinders, the screen printers, digital printing, and we get them to geotag those on a map. So we're creating a library of resources for students in that particular city. That's great for when they're actually studying. But what's really significant is when they then finish, they have then got that library of resources that they know of, and they've had that time to practice. So if they then suddenly engage with a client project where they're going to produce, a piece of print, or they're going to work with a certain sort of product or exhibition designer, they might have made those connections already. So that's a really sort of valuable point, I think, of finding and sort of locating those resources. And I think it just means there's horses for courses. You can go to a university, study there, go back to your home city, and then you've suddenly got to find all those resources again. So actually through the course, we're also exploring and connecting. The other thing that happens that's really great is that students maybe from different countries, or even within a single country, they might suddenly make these connections with one another, and then they can collaborate together, or they can actually think, do you know what? Let's start doing some projects together. So then you start to get this really interesting hybridization of a professional practice setup. And that, to be fair, we saw that happening, 20 years ago, when actually even there came a point where clients want to know where the office is. And actually now you don't know whether that studio is operating from 3 or 4 bases, or everyone's sitting around the same table. Look at us here now. So that's a kind of an amazing thing. And it's a kind of, it shows that fluidity. And I think what happened with building online sort of environments for learning is that basically there came a point where the technology was not a barrier. So actually generally we think now, well, basically if you can think something, you can kind of make it, and so certainly at student level, there will be those instances in terms of making where, okay, you need to do a piece of Arduino, you need to learn about coding. We're not necessarily providing that facility, but we will make those connections so you can start to bring that into your work. And certainly I think we always say with postgraduate courses, getting the master's degree is amazing, but actually what you're doing, you're starting a new kind of journey where your work will extend beyond the masters, and it stands as this kind of a sort of process of revitalization in terms of your own creative direction. Yeah, that was certainly that kind of tool within the online course is really important, and we try to also use that, in the practical sense as well for project work.
Yeah, I love what you said, that nowadays we ask where is the office based, and there is no such thing, right?
Yeah.
I think also to AIGA as the national team, I mean, we used to have an office at some point in New York, but now everybody's spread. Majority based in the East Coast, but we don't have Lishan is in Rhode Island, I'm in New York. So it's just very interesting to see how that can work actually.
Yeah, and the other thing I think is important to bear in mind is even, again, post-COVID, the cost of rentals and studios in, professional environments are actually evolving how they work. So, in London last week, you have a scenario where actually coming to the studio from Tuesday to Thursday and then working away. And actually it does raise the question of how we evolve studio culture and studio kind of society. Because certainly if you're an undergrad and you're coming, actually a lot of the big studios are looking, you learn so much for being in the studio. So actually, part of the questioning around the online space, and I think certainly when we have modules like studio and entrepreneurship, we are actually asking students to question the role of the working space and how can we make either a digital environment or an actual space, a physical space, work for us as, a place of creative safety where we can challenge and test new ideas. And that's a really sort of significant part of what we do, because, you know, doing an online creative course like graphic design is not just about us taking content and putting it online. It's actually us about innovating within the space so that we can test and trial new ways of working together. And I think, you know, that for me is one of the most exciting things about doing this course. And I suppose, you know, nearly 10 years down the line, you know, we're experienced now in generating those kind of ideas and actually creating a kind of, we call an online pedagogy that is both sort of innovative, but is also one that, you know, you don't come out at the end of the course and say, oh my God, I've been locked in a dark room for, you know, for sort of 2 years. Actually, you come out with, you know, with a rejuvenated practice, and you have all those skills to engage in a sort of hybrid environment, which we're doing now. And that's what's happening in studios as well. So it's a kind of, you know, it's an exciting space, but it's no different. And I think also, you know, with graphic design anyway, it's always had a juggle with technology, you know, whether that was and how we interpret that in terms of the work of the hand and the eye. You know, when the first book was printed, there was skepticism around certain sort of that technology, and we continue to have to embrace that and use it in the most sort of, you know, exciting and relevant and authentic way.
So we've been talking about these collaborations that you've been creating space for across cultures and geographies. I'm curious about interdisciplinary collaborations as well, you know, because as designers, we're not just working with other designers. It could be working with a musician or an entrepreneur or a technologist. So could you give some examples of how these interdisciplinary collaborations happen in your course or with your students?
Yeah, of course. So basically, we'll start. I'll give a couple of examples. I mean, one is actually within the course itself. So we are likely to have students from quite some different fields. So very often you might have someone who, let's say, like many famous musicians, they studied graphic design and then they became a musician, and they may have come from a different background. So whilst we might think on MA graphic design, they're all very hardcore typographers and, you know, sort of have come from and we do have those. And that's we also have some folk who've come from, they might have been illustrators, they might have been artists, they might be musicians, and they're coming in with a strong kind of skills. But, you know, one of the sort of ways that we might sort of use those in a more interdisciplinary way, in a surprising way, because I think that's the other thing. Surprise in an interdisciplinary sort of context is like really exciting. And I've always loved that in a design sort of teaching or working situation where someone puts an idea forward and you kind of go, oh my goodness, where did that come from? So we have, you know, one of the projects we have is where we ask students to highlight an issue in their sort of local environment that perhaps needs to change. And they create an output of that. They might make a film, they might make a poster, they might make a kind of report, if you like, that explains or tells that story. Now, that could be quite interdisciplinary. It might be could be something to do with adult literacy. It might be something with sustainability or environment. So we're dealing with different types of disciplines and challenges. And we look at those, and then everyone thinks they're going to solve their problem. Mm-hmm. But actually what we do, we throw the balls in the air. And in fact, someone from New York is going to be solving a problem from someone in Mumbai. So it kind of switches around. So it's not only interdisciplinary sort of working, but it's also intercultural working and how we can learn from those disciplines, which is really exciting. Another example I'd also give is something we did recently, which was through a kind of campus experience, but it gives a sense of the spirit. So we were looking at, at Falmouth, we're really lucky in that we're a specialist arts university. We have architects, choreographers, graphic designers, artists, fashion designers, sort of all working under the same roof, or the same sort of online space. And we were working with an arts critic who was looking at transdisciplinary working. So we thought, let's give that a go. So we kind of we wanted to learn from, if we set a range of different students. So basically, although we were doing this on campus, we would also be encouraging students online to actually work maybe, they might be doing a project where they want to work with a musician and an architect, and they would bring those in. So we use that interdisciplinary kind of catalyst to sort of challenge new ways of thinking. So the example that I was going to give about the music project is we put fashion designers, graphic designers, musicians all in one sort of room, and they had to explore the idea of kind of collaboration. And what was also really important, that there was very different neurodiversities within those groups as well, which was, for me, a really, truly exciting, open kind of creative environment. And what was amazing is that we started to have some of the team just started playing music, but they did it in the answer to the collaboration brief, and the drum would go a bit fast, then the guitar would come in, and you just saw a metaphor for how different personalities work within a team. Another one which was really amazing, there was a student who remembers their music through writing stories. Writing down words. And so the graphic designer saw, here's a typographic system here. So basically they assigned musical notes to different levels to different letters of the alphabet. And then they just said a statement, the big brown house is on the top of the green hill. And from that, they started creating a piece of music from that. So that was a really amazing example of actually how disciplines can inspire one of those and inspire one another to kind of find completely different angles and ways of seeing a kind of problem. And I think that's what's really exciting about how the sort of evolution of our different subjects are going, is that if you've got these platforms and these open spaces for very inclusive and accessible ways of sharing ideas and learning, then work is made that completely surprises you. And I think that point comes back to industry looking in on Falmouth to kind of think about, well, industry doesn't have all the answers. What if education is starting to challenge and explore new models of practice and interdisciplinary working? So we might call it convergence practice, where actually many disciplines are kind of working together and coming up maybe with solutions, ideas that weren't part of the original brief, but actually enable us to sort of understand something in a different way, which you might sort of bring. There's two designers academics, Stephanie and Bruce Tharp, who've written an amazing book on discursive design. And we know with those sorts of ideas that they're there to provoke discussion. They're not providing a real world solution, but sometimes they can be as powerful as a real world solution. So all of those different ways of making through interdisciplinary, intercultural, both speculative ideas, real world ideas, they all allow the kind of graphic design student within our course to kind of not only explore the absolute kind of hallowed ground of graphic design, but also see where it might go, see where it might take us. And those are the exciting bits. And I think that's where the sort of research sort of foundation is really important to that sort of master's study, and can also elevate your journey as a practitioner to something that surprises you, So I think, again, it's an ongoing kind of fascination for me to find these different ways of understanding. But the driver is that sort of creative curiosity, we might.
Yeah, there's a real richness to all of these different layers and all of these places that graphic design can take you beyond maybe some of the initial surface level things that attract people to design in the first place. I'd love to ask you this question that's the hot topic all over right now, is how you're navigating the AI questions. I think we're all trying to figure this out as we go, but are there any things that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, basically, I guess it's an ongoing debate. I suppose, one of the approaches we think about this at Falmouth is to kind of, we need to be skeptical, but we also need to be curious. I think that's kind of really important. So we have to engage with it. We have to sort of think about it and face up to the opportunities it can bring as a sort of form of invention. But I think it's also, I guess we sort of acknowledge that there are there's a lot of debate around its role as a generative tool. actually also as a kind of an assistive tool, it's also really important. So we might sort of say a creative partner or a creative assistant. Yeah. But what's really important now is that we actually acknowledge its use. We acknowledge what we're doing to be creative with it. So there's maybe a time, certainly in kind of in academia, where maybe someone's writing an essay and you're kind of not sure what's going to happen. Now we have a very stringent sort of policy at Falmouth where acknowledgement of the role of AI within that sort of project is really important. So we all know it can help with certain things in terms of grammar and all those kind of things. It can certainly speed up sort of research. It can do a number of those things. But the key thing is we're acknowledging it, we're experimenting with it, and we're actually curious of the tool. So therefore, I think for us to maybe say, oh, we're not, AI is not on the table here. It's definitely not about that at all. But at the same time, we want to hear all those different voices. So actually, it was only a month ago we had, for example, particularly on our illustration courses, obviously where the generative side of it is a real worry, particularly for new students, new parents. They're all sort of thinking, actually, what's happening with art and design? Is it going to be taken over? But actually, we empowered our students to be part of the symposium to talk about AI and illustration. And it was a very sort of inclusive approach to discussing it. So rather than the university saying, this is what we're going to do, you can't do this, you can't do that, we wanted to hear from our students to understand like what they thought about it and what we believe its role is. But ultimately now it's a more kind of transparent approach to how we accept it into our sort of partnering as long as within a creative sort of process. So I definitely think that sort of there is a healthy skepticism, but also a really fascinating curiosity. And I think you see pieces of work emerging. There was a lovely piece of work that was done by an ad agency where they basically pitted Serena Williams against herself at sort of 5 or 6 different points in her athletic career. And they made a tournament. Now, we could never do that before. So that was really fascinating. So I think when you see it being used really creatively, it's amazing. And but I think it's not, I think when we have industry online into our sort of studios, we're always asking them about it. And of course, there's an absolute kind of acknowledgement that to some areas of business, it will start to kind of, it will take over those areas. But at the higher level, the strategic level, where that kind of critical thinking needs to come in, it has to start with us as human thinkers. And we can use. I've done a lot of healthcare based work, and we've used AI to. We did a project about loneliness and dementia. So we actually used an AI algorithm to analyze human stories of those with early onset dementia. And it gave a score of loneliness. It wasn't to solve anything or give them drugs, but it was helping the NHS to prioritize care. And to me, that was like an amazing thing. The idea of understanding a story from a different perspective was just like, that was amazing. And actually, going back to the interdisciplinary thing, I had no idea we could do something like that. So I went to a conference, spoke to a doctor. We were talking about this idea. And then suddenly this machine learning engineer comes along and said, oh, we can use this algorithm to do that. And to me, that's this amazing sense of actually how we embrace that interdisciplinary field. And I think that's the other really important thing, is a lot of the things we're also exploring is this kind of nexus between creativity and technology, art and science. And I think, we have to be round the table, and we want our students to be around the table in terms of that debate and involve them with it, and for them to feel part of that sort of discussion.
Yeah, that's wonderful. A lot of it is just experimentation and asking the right questions and finding these unexpected collaborations, like with the machine learning thing. I wanted to give you, Bryan, a chance to maybe sum up or try to tie together some of these threads before I turn it back to Julia for the closing questions of what are the future designers you're trying to produce? I know that you have a diversity of students and experiences, but what are some of the common threads of the kinds of future design professionals that you're trying to educate?
I think ultimately, with all of our students at Falmouth, and on probably many more universities, we are looking to kind of create sort of curious and courageous sort of thinkers who can kind of be comfortable with discomfort and kind of be brave enough to suggest different ideas. And certainly, when we like to sort of impart that on our students. So when they do come to their first job or come to a new job, they have that kind of confidence to maybe express an idea and to argue that idea and to promote that idea. I think what's really interesting about the online student, particularly within the context of the sort of graphic design and our sort of global studio, is that they start to kind of, and that's part of the master's course as well, is like actually really understanding what your voice is, what your story is, where you want to take your work. And actually, I think what the cultural interdisciplinary story does is makes you kind of grow a richer empathy for others. And it also allows you to really consider, actually, if I do engage with my coder friend in Tokyo, or I think about a sort of, a certain digital artist in sort of Mumbai, wherever it might be, that suddenly I can bring really new perspectives. And like the music sort of idea, the music project I spoke about, actually embracing a very rich and diverse kind of multicultural, multi-gender, multi sort of ethnic space where everybody can share openly. It sounds like a little bit of a kind of utopian view, but I think when folk do have that chance to discuss with one another many different ideas from many different perspectives, I think that makes for a sort of rich individual and someone who is knows themselves a little bit more. I think the other thing that particularly for the online student is they start to feel confident about being able to innovate within a digital and hybridized studio environment. And it's clear that the kind of, there are times when we can work, and as we're doing now, sort of talk many thousands of miles away, but there's also those times when we have to make that decision, yes, to go to that country, to talk with our client, back to the Bob Gill story, to actually really sort of experience that sort of problem, to understand, to listen, notice the ignored that maybe only our human eyes might see, or perhaps not our human eyes, maybe non-human eyes might see. And we have to sort of understand a problem from all those different sort of perspectives. And I think the other thing about, which is, it's the responsibility of education, but certainly at Falmouth and certainly online students, that we are asking them to really question the status quo. There may be different ways that could be more sustainable, that might not be a bit about growth. They might be about degrowth. They might be about thinking in a new way of doing things where maybe resources are far less, but actually by thinking about that creatively, empowering others, citizen innovators to work with us, that we can start to kind of, sort of find new ways of creating more effective and sort of ethical impact in what we do. So to me, that's a sort of exciting thing about the student. It's like, and maybe it's not change. Maybe we're always being curious about finding new ways of thinking, liberating different ways of working together. But I think the online environment is one that actually encourages folk to not be limited by the screen, but actually this is just a vehicle in which you can kind of carry on working and connecting with both, the real world and a richer culture of students. And to be honest, going back to, again, the early part, like why an online course? Well, actually, it is one of the most innovative ways to learn about graphic design now, because we can build such a kind of rich cross-cultural community. I think it will be really fascinating to see our students in 10 years' time, like how have they innovated? In fact, when I spoke about Wiedemann Lamp, that was important because actually I took them on as graduates 25 years ago in the studio I worked at in London, and to see them take on that sort of that responsibility, but also innovating where the industry is going and taking responsibility for the archival history of what's happened. It, for me, is like a kind of, it's a really heartwarming thing to see, young designers really working through. And I think by giving that sense of trust and confidence and autonomy that I think comes through the course, that actually when we see what are they going to bring to the creative industries is a really kind of exciting thing. So I think that's the sort of, and it cycles back, that's why I gave that example of Wiedemann Lamp, because actually most professionals are also keen to invest in, what's coming through. And actually that's why, from my perspective, I'm in the seesaw moment between half industry, half that actually I see the same kind of investment that amazing design studios and professionals have with their young designers, as I hope we do in our students, from an academic's point of view. So that's the hope and the joy.
Yeah, I love
Wonderful.
that, Brian. I think, speaking of questioning the status quo, the next question fits very well. I wanted to hear from you, if you could redesign a product or a service or space from scratch, anything that you wish, what would you choose and why?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I mean, I'll nestle into an area that I've worked on for both in my professional world and that's a lot of my career is being spent in sort of designing for food and health. And I suppose if I had that chance, I'd probably think about the relationship between food and health and how can we make that better. So probably I'd like to think about designing better legislation, designing information systems to better inform individuals to make sort of healthier choices, more kind of maybe ethical choices about the way they live, which actually also impacts on others and the health of not only them, but the planet as well. So a bit lofty, but actually I do know that there are things around preventative healthcare start with very simple kind of decisions. And actually, again, design maybe has had its hand in promoting different types of behaviors. And I think, that's probably why I've slightly shifted from the world of sort of pure graphic design and branding to actually taking those problem skills and critical ways of thinking and bringing that into the field of sort of healthcare design. So yeah, that's probably what I try to do. It's about information systems and making sort of positive choices for individuals and the wider world.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. I love that when we ask this for participant here in the podcast, people answer very different things.
Yeah.
So it's great. It's great. We've heard already redesigning education, redesigning email and spam, redesigning the subway system in New York. So it's just very cool to see what's on people's minds. So yeah, that's great.
No, you're welcome.
To close up here, we wanted to hear what has been inspiring you lately. It could be like a book, a film, an exhibition, music, album, anything that has been feeding your creative soul.
Yeah, well, I have to, I mean, I'm from London originally. I was born there and worked there for 20 odd years. And I still love going back up there. And actually, when I was up there the other week, I went to Japan House, which had an exhibition of 100 makers from Japan. And actually that was really inspiring. It reminds us of the value of, I'll say it again, the kind of learning from other cultures and looking at the similarities and differences, the way we use materials, the way we use our hands, the way we use technology to make the world around us. And there's so much we can learn from that. I think the other thing that came out from that is also, I picked up a book, called Packaging, and it was curated by Kenya Hara, and actually it was in Japan they have the sort of Takeo paper sort of exhibitions that happen through. They did a lovely one on sort of haptic, and they've done different on paper, different types of exhibition. But this one was talking about different types of packaging. And the book starts at both ends. One is on functionality, and the other way of defining packaging is about laughter. And again, I love the two complete contrasts that could perhaps come from a Japanese way of a philosophical way of thinking. But again, to me, it sort of highlights the joy of how we learn from different perspectives. And so whilst I also went to the Wes Anderson exhibition, which was amazing, the Design Museum, I also loved the kind of the different sort of contrast. So I think that's a real treat. And it's another thing to say, I think, that whilst, if you're studying London, you have all those things. If we're studying Cornwall, we have museums. If you're online, we're encouraging people to really invest and understand the culture that is around them, because we often find that even we don't look enough, we don't go out and enjoy the environment or enjoy exhibitions and things like that. So there's this kind of continuous tension. But certainly from my own perspective, that was a real sort of injection of inspiration and joy, having seen that exhibition and bought yet another book on design.
That's great. That's awesome. So, Bryan, as a final call to action for our listeners here, for our community, can you let them know where to find you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, I'm. If anyone wants to email me, I'm at Bryan BRYN.Clark CLARK at falmouth.ac.uk. If you go to Falmouth, www.falmouth.ac.uk, you'll get the information about the courses that we run online and obviously on campus. And I'm really interested to hear from people as well, that if there's anything they want to talk or discuss about, it might be someone from industry who thinks, actually, I'd love to contribute to one of your, to your online program. I'd love to visit Falmouth. Or it might be, I'd love to study at Falmouth, or I'd love to study online. So the most important thing is that dialogue kind of happens, and I think people are a little bit worried about getting in touch, but, that's what I would say. Please do get in touch. I can also pass individuals on to different folk, different departments. So, we are genuinely fascinated and open to sharing sort of dialogue and discussion around what we do, whether that's studying or contributing to what we do here at Falmouth. So yeah, please do get in touch or share your stories or interests. We'd love that.
Yeah, Wonderful. I love it.
Thanks so much, Bryan. And we'll post links to relevant resources in the show notes. And for our listeners, you can also get in touch with us, podcast@aiga.org. Please leave us a review or like us, tell a friend about this. But until next time, I am Lishan Huang on behalf of Julia and Bryan. See you later.
Thank you so much.